you probably hate being cold. When the temperature drops, you zip up your jacket, turn on the heater in your car, and get somewhere warm as fast as possible. If you get caught in freezing rain, it ruins your entire day. We think of heat as a basic human right, but picture yourself in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The water is freezing, the wind is howling, and you are sitting in a wooden boat with absolutely no roof, no walls, and no way to start a fire. We imagine Vikings as these massive, loud warriors drinking in warm mead halls. We picture them wearing thick furs and roaring into battle. But the reality of their expansion across the ocean is a much darker, much quieter story of extreme human endurance. They crossed some of the most violent, freezing waters on Earth in boats that offered zero protection, and they did it entirely without fire. How they actually survived the freezing dark is a biological and psychological nightmare that most people today could not handle for a single night. To understand the trap they were in, you have to look at the ship itself. When we think of historical sailing ships, we picture galleons or merchant vessels. Those ships had lower decks. They had cabins. If the weather got bad, the crew could go below deck, shut a heavy wooden hatch, and escape the wind. A Viking longship did not have a lower deck. It was completely open to the elements. It was essentially a shallow wooden bowl sitting on top of the freezing ocean. If it rained, you got wet. If the waves crashed over the side, you were sitting in freezing salt water. There was nowhere to hide. You couldn't go below deck because there was no below deck. The entire crew sat exposed on open wooden benches for days or even weeks at a time. And the most terrifying part was the absolute lack of heat. You cannot build a fire on a shallow, open wooden boat in the middle of a storm. The wind would blow the embers instantly, and the ship would burn down in the middle of the ocean. So they were wet, they were exposed, and they had absolutely no external source of heat. By modern survival standards, a crew caught in a North Atlantic storm under those conditions should be dead from hypothermia in hours. But they didn't die. They made it to Iceland, Greenland, and North America, and they did it by completely abandoning the idea of staying dry. Modern outdoor survival tells you that staying dry is the only way to stay alive. The Vikings knew that staying dry on an open longship was physically impossible, so they engineered a way to survive while soaking wet. The secret was not animal fur. Fur gets heavy, waterlogged, and useless in heavy salt spray. The secret was a highly specialized, intensely woven wool called vadmal. Women back in Scandinavia spent massive amounts of time spinning and weaving this specific type of heavy cloth. But they didn't just weave it. They intentionally left the natural sheep grease right inside the fibers. This grease is called lanolin. If you touch raw sheep wool, it feels oily. That oil is a natural waterproofing wax. By weaving the wool tightly and leaving the lanolin inside, they created a garment that acted like a primitive neoprene wetsuit. When the freezing ocean water hit the vadmal, the lanolin forced the water to bead up and roll off. And even when the wool eventually got soaked through, it did something that cotton or leather cannot do. It trapped the body's heat inside the wet fibers. The clothing was just the first layer of defense. You can wear the best wool in the world, but if you sit still in freezing wind for 2 weeks, your core temperature will eventually drop. The Vikings needed to generate constant internal heat, and they did that through brutal, continuous physical labor. A longship was powered by a massive square sail, but when the wind died or the weather turned hostile, they had to row. Rowing a heavy wooden ship through freezing ocean swells requires a massive amount of physical exertion. Your heart rate spikes, your muscles burn, your body becomes a furnace. The men would rotate on the oars, essentially using the intense physical labor as a human heater. When a man was rowing, he wasn't just moving the ship, he was pumping hot blood through his freezing limbs. But you can't row forever. Eventually, you have to sleep. And sleeping on an open, freezing boat is when hypothermia normally takes over. To solve this, they used something called a Hudfat. A Hudfat was a massive, thick sleeping bag made of treated leather, usually cow or seal skin. But one man didn't sleep in it alone. 2 or 3 men would crawl inside a single Hudfat together. They used the shared heat of multiple human bodies trapped inside a windproof leather sack to survive the night. They would wedge themselves under the wooden rowing benches, pulling the leather tight against the freezing spray, and sleep in a tangled, shivering pile while the ship pitched in the dark. And then there was the food. You can't cook without a fire. That meant the crew ate completely cold, preserved rations for the entire voyage. Their survival diet relied heavily on stockfish, which is cod that has been hung up and dried in the freezing wind until it becomes as hard as wood. To eat it, they had to break off chunks and chew on it for hours just to soften it. They paired this with sour butter and skyr beer, an ancient fermented dairy product. It was a diet of pure fat and dense protein. They needed massive amounts of calories just to keep their internal organs functioning against the cold, and they ate it all in the freezing dark, tasting nothing but salt and old fish. But this survival system was incredibly fragile. The history books focus on the successful voyages, but they often ignore the dark, quiet reality of the ones who didn't make it. If a storm lasted too long, the Vadmal wool would eventually reach its limit. Wool can hold a lot of water, but when it becomes completely saturated, it gets unbelievably heavy. A man wearing soaked, heavy wool on a violently pitching boat is constantly fighting gravity. If a rogue wave hit the ship and a man went overboard, the weight of his own survival gear would drag him down into the black water in seconds. There was no turning the ship around in a storm. There were no rescue operations. If you went into the water, your crewmates just watched you disappear. And even if you stayed on the boat, the psychological toll was devastating. Imagine sitting completely soaked in freezing water for 7 days straight. Your skin starts to break down from the constant salt exposure. You have saltwater sores rubbing against coarse wool. You are exhausted, sleep-deprived, and shivering uncontrollably. You can't stand up and walk around because the boat is too narrow and the waves are too high. You are trapped in a tiny wooden box in the middle of a violent black ocean, just waiting for the weather to break. Many men died quietly on those benches. The crew would just find them unresponsive in the morning, their core temperature having finally crashed during the night. They would roll the body over the side and keep rowing. We live in a completely different world now. Our modern relationship with cold is based entirely on avoidance. When we feel a chill, we change our environment. We adjust the thermostat. We plug in a space heater. We buy jackets engineered in laboratories to keep the elements away from our skin. We view cold as a temporary problem that technology is supposed to fix. We never actually sit in the cold and let our bodies do the work. But the Vikings couldn't change their environment. They had to change themselves. They accepted that they were going to be cold, wet, and miserable, and they trusted their biology to handle it. They didn't rely on external heat. They relied on the heat they could generate from their own muscles and the bodies of the men sitting next to them. They understood that the human body is an incredible furnace if you fuel it right and refuse to stop moving. We have completely lost that physical confidence. We panic if the power goes out during a winter storm because we forgot how to survive without a machine doing the warming for us. We look at the cold as an enemy, while they looked at it as just another condition of being alive. Survival is rarely about being comfortable. It is usually about finding out exactly how much misery you can tolerate before your body finally quits. The men who crossed those freezing oceans didn't do it because they had better technology or magical ships. They did it because they were willing to endure a level of suffering that would break a modern human in a single afternoon. They knew that the fire wasn't coming. They knew the sun wasn't going to warm them. They sat in the dark, shivering in the salt spray, and decided that they were just going to keep rowing until they found land. And maybe that is the real lesson hiding in the history books. You don't always need a fire to survive the dark. Sometimes you just need to refuse to stop moving.